for whom I did this presentation some number of years ago, and we did an excursion based on replicating a chapel car experience. And that's what you're looking at actually on this opening slide. It's either 2009 or 2011, I forget which set of pictures this is because we did it twice. But that in the upper right-hand corner is what most museum members would recognize as, back then, the rail car called La Condesa, which was housed at the Santa Maria Valley Railroad and used for a period of time for excursions. And so that's what we did. We used the La Condesa to simulate a chapel car experience. The picture in the upper left, inset picture, is not the chapel car setup, but it was a previous dining excursion that the La Condesa had on Santa Maria Valley, where it's all set up for dinner, obviously. But I wanted to show that to you because it's looking into the car from the back door towards the front of the car, and on either side of the opening into the galley, you see a bar area on the left and a piano and kind of another booth or kind of waiter's table on the right. That bar area on the left will become the pulpit for the chapel car experience that we had, and we didn't actually use the piano. It was pretty terribly out of tune. It needed all kinds of repair and wouldn't hold a tune anyway. And then the lower right inset, or the lower right picture, is looking in the opposite direction on the chapel car experience day. You're looking at the quote-unquote congregation, and on the far right you can see a fraction of my dad, actually, who was the minister for the day. He preached a little thing about the chapel cars. I don't remember what all was part of it, but you can see him at the pulpit, which was really the car's bar. Okay, let's get going here. Railroad chapel cars are an interesting topic. I first even recognized them by running into this book, that's the cover of which is on your screen right now. This Train is Bound for Glory. It's a great coffee table type book, all about the chapel cars, the railroad chapel cars, which you're going to learn about in this presentation. And it was very fortuitous. I mean, you'd think my dad was not only a Presbyterian minister for all his career, but he was, even before that, a rail fan, a rail nut, and did a lot of model railroading. He got his first train for his very first birthday. It was a Lionel train like everybody else got for their first birthday back in the 1920s. And so anyway, a father and a son, both heavily involved in railroading and church activities and all that sort of thing, and neither of us had ever heard of chapel cars before until we happened to go to a Friends of the Santa Maria Valley Railroad fundraising dinner, and they had a silent auction table, and somebody had put this book on the auction table. So that started a whole thing in our family, and really was the inspiration and start of this presentation. Okay, let me move it on here. All right. Obviously, both churches, meaning religion, and railroads go back a long time. Most of you are probably, at least the railroaders among you, are probably familiar with old wagon ways that you could pull multiple stagecoach-like or container-type cars along on a track, which were not much more than ruts in the ground. Steam locomotives came along in the very early 1800s, which you can see a little diagram picture of one there. Probably everybody is familiar with the Transcontinental Railroad story, which got railroads really going strong in the mid-1800s, late 1800s with the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1840, interestingly enough, there was about 3,000 miles of track in the United States. By 1850, that had tripled to about 9,000 miles. By 1890, which is roughly the beginning of the chapel car era, 167,000 miles of railroad track in the United States. And by 1920, which was basically the peak of chapel cars and maybe into the decline of their use, there was 250,000 miles of track in the United States. So there was plenty of opportunity to get around. There's the Golden Spike thing, which we talked about a lot last week, 1869. I'm just trying to give you a time period thing here. In those early railroad days, you know, the Old West was rough and tumble, right? People referred to it as lawless and all that good stuff. So people were looking for ways to get church things going in order to tame that wild world, you might say. Well, there were a number of railroad cars being developed and were developed at this time. Pullman was building sleeper cars. They had upper berths. The dining car came along not too long later. There became luxury chair cars, which was more like individual cushy chairs instead of benches or you know, rows of seats like that. So it was not unknown to have unique uses for railroad cars. And the church connection, you might say, kind of developed early on too, where in response to the church leaders, or some church leaders, who wanted to ban the railroad activity on Sundays, just like everything else was supposed to be, you know, you're supposed to rest on Sunday. So in something of a appeasement, the railroaders put in pianos or maybe pump organs into their railroad cars, and they would sing hymns on Sunday mornings as the passengers rode along. So there was bits and pieces of what ultimately became chapel cars along the way. In the early 1800s, there were certainly mobile chapel cars of sorts, even if they weren't on rails. This is a chapel wagon that was used primarily to sell books and church publications and that sort of thing, the coal porters of the era. And this is a real old kind of drawing of a chapel box on wheels. It's that little thing in the center there that I'm kind of going, a real dark little thing, was on wheels being pulled from city to city or area to area. It's kind of to anything that carries itinerant preachers. And lest we think this idea was limited to the United States, the idea for it actually came from Russia. One of the people that ultimately built and ran a chapel car in the United States actually got the idea from seeing this chapel car on the Western Siberian Railway in Russia. So that's really, I guess, where the complete idea started, was in Russia. Uncle Boston was one of the first people to dream up this idea of a chapel car in the United States. There's his picture. The next couple of slides are going to give you an idea of where these chapel cars roamed across the mostly western United States, but not entirely. Here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them, each one marked by a different color, showing where they went primarily. And you can see there was some concentration of where the cars went, but they weren't small areas. Almost all the areas except the Episcopal car up by Lake Michigan, which was the smallest area covered by a car. Most of them were multiple states, and in several cases, lots of states they went through. So this is the first bunch of Baptist cars and a couple of Episcopal cars. And then here on the next slide are the balance of the Baptist cars. And on this map anyway, probably the activity goes as far east as any of them did, with the yellow one, the number 6 chapel car, Herald of Hope. And the Messenger of Peace, the blue one, number 5, goes all the way into New York State. But like I said, most of them were west. Well, here's another set, went all the way to the East Coast. So they kind of went everywhere. Well, you probably could argue that the concentration of them was in the West. And that was it. Those were the only. There was only about a dozen of them. Let's see, 7 and 3 and 2 or something like that. And that's all there were that we really know much about. And here's an interesting graphic that gives you a notion of when they ran. This is not entirely complete because not all 10 or 12 are on here, but it's roughly gives you the idea of when these cars ran. Way back in the 1880s is when the Russians started using the chapel cars like we saw in that one Western Siberian Railway picture. And then the first chapel car in the United States was completed in 1891 and began its service. And actually it was that car that kind of lasted the longest into the 1940s. The bulk of them were doing their thing from 1900 to the 1920s. And then they started retiring, getting sold off, getting parted out, that sort of thing, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Here's a textual summary. Well, let's just count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 of them that we know a fair amount about. And there was another one, by the way, which I don't know hardly anything about. There was a Mormon rail car earlier than these, like in the 1870s. But I think it was primarily a car for Brigham Young to use, not so much a car for holding services or Sunday school or whatnot in. And that's now I've told you about everything I know about that car. I couldn't really find any information on it. Certainly nothing about its use as a chapel car. And I think I remember reading that the best guess as to what happened to it was that after Brigham Young died in 1870-something, it was probably returned to some sort of regular rail service and not used for any kind of religious group at all anyway. So, okay, here's on the screen is a list of stuff. The interesting thing is the disposition of them, or the column on the right that's marked currently. This was good at least a few years ago. I'm not sure if it's entirely good, but there are typically 3 or 4 kinds of disposals or dispositions to these cars. One was that they were parted out, and when they did that, it was generally used parted out for some kind of church activity, whether it was to take bits and pieces of it to a church on the ground somewhere, or sold off to pay for money to build a church on the ground. Or some combination or thing like that. Others ended up as gift shops, as restored cars for display, and some just kind of rotted away. We'll see some pictures of those too. This picture is here mainly to give you an idea of the general layout of almost all of these chapel cars. You can see there's at the bottom where there's a diagram. On the right is basically the church area or chapel part of the car. Half of it, roughly, people would come and go through the rear door of the car. The altar area where the preacher preaches and Sunday school teachers taught and whatever was going on would be in the front of that area, which was basically in the middle of the car. Behind that altar area, there would be the living quarters for the preacher and his wife and or family, depending on if he had a wife and or family. So you can see there's bedrooms and a kind of a kitchen area, kitchen table, and so on and so forth. So that was the general layout of almost all of these cars. Here's a picture of the very first one, the one that went into service in 1890. It's called the Church of the Advent, built by the Pullman Company. This is a picture of a guy named Bishop William David Walter. He was the builder of the Advent, the first chapel car, and he's the guy that I mentioned earlier that had seen chapel cars in Russia earlier, and that's where he got the idea and the inspiration for this. There's an interior view of the Advent before all the furniture and whatnot was put into it. And speaking of the furniture, the permanent pews were not necessarily built into these cars, at least not initially. And here's a good example. The Advent, the first one, it was just a big open space like in that previous picture, which I think was more like a restored, polished up version, not a delivered version, but I'm not sure about that. Anyway, no permanent pews, just chairs that they could rearrange, move around. That piano on the left, probably on wheels, could be rolled around. They could set it up for whatever they wanted to do. This is a stained glass window that's in a church in Fargo, North Dakota, that commemorates the use or the work of the chapel car Advent. And you can see an image, a drawing, a kind of a cartoon actually of the rail car in the upper part of that picture. And in that church are some of the parts and objects from that car. At least they were at the time this picture was taken. The other company that built chapel cars, other than the Pullman car company, was the Barney and Smith manufacturing company. And they were the ones that were called upon to build the second rail car that went chapel car that went into service in 1891, called Evangel. And here's a picture of the Evangel from 1891, the year it was delivered. Uncle Boston, one of the chapel car initiators that you saw a picture of earlier with the goatee. Here he is pictured on the platform of the railcar Evangel. Okay, hang on, here we go. This is a picture in the First Baptist Church of Everett, Washington, commemorating the use of Evangel, or it's probably a painting, I'm sorry, not a picture. And you can see the rail car in the picture on the right. Bits and pieces of Evangel are actually built into the First Baptist Church of Rawlins, Wyoming. That's where anything recognizable these days of Evangel ended up. We're not talking about like whole rooms or anything, but doors and chairs and bookshelves and such. And I think we have a picture of, no, maybe not. Somewhere, maybe later on we'll see some of that. The Episcopal Diocese of Northern Michigan, that was the the one color on the map that kind of was in and around Lake Michigan. Built a couple of chapel cars in the early 1890s that went to work up there. There's what one of them looked like in Ontonagon. I don't know the year, sorry. Here's the second Baptist car that was built in 1893. This one was built by the Barney and Smith Company. The cost of this car was $7,500. That's what it cost the Baptist folks to have this car built and get it into service. The organ, which is on the right of the preacher there in the picture, was an SD pump organ, which was supplied by the Colonel J.J. SD Organ Company of Vermont. Very popular pump organ for the time. So, of course, you put it in the chapel car. Here's a manual in 1896 in a town in California. Sunday school was a big deal, by the way, and that's why you see a lot of kids. The women of particularly the far west, Wild West town, the women were very concerned that they get things under control in the sense of tamed and moral behavior and all that sort of thing. So they wanted desperately for Sunday school type activities for their kids. And that was a large part of what these chapel cars provided. When they pull up into town, they were there for however long, and they would do a number of Sunday school classes during that few weeks or few months while the car was in town. The other big audience that the chapel car folks were going after, and in fact did get, was the railroad workers themselves, who were encouraged to come as you are. Don't worry about cleaning up all that much. We know you don't do that except once every other month or whatever it was. And just come and enjoy the service and learn a little something maybe. There's the Emmanuel in Oregon. And here's some of those railroad men I was talking about. And one guy there in the middle holding the Bible. How about that? This is the picture. I tried to find pictures of chapel cars as close to San Luis Obispo as I could find, because clearly they were in and around San Luis Obispo at least. But this is an actual picture of one as close as I could get. It's the car Emmanuel that was in Santa Barbara on whatever year this was. I don't know when this picture was taken, but I know they got at least as close as Santa Barbara. And then the period of its use came to an end, and in this case the car was retired in a field in South Dakota and got to be in pretty bad shape. But it didn't stay that way very long. In this particular case, the car was picked up by an organization, I'm not sure the name of it, and restored up in Prairie Village, South Dakota. And I think you can still see that car there today under this same shelter in its restored sort of form. Interestingly enough, Prairie Village, my dad ended his career with 20-some years at a Presbyterian church in Prairie Village, Kansas. So we got a kick out of that. Here's another of the cars, the number 3 Baptist car called Glad Tidings. This is how it looked with a Sunday school class in it in Wisconsin in 1894. Another picture of Glad Tidings, not with a Sunday school class, but what looks like a pretty rugged group of men. Interestingly to note, too, Thomas Edison donated phonographs to all of the chapel cars. So if they didn't have a piano or someone who could play it or something, they could put a record on the phonograph or the roll on the photograph, whichever version it was, I'm not sure, and have some kind of music playing in these cars. The chapel car in this picture is in the upper right there. You're looking at the rear end of the car, and probably the missus has the laundry hanging out on the back railing of the car to dry or air out or what have you. Here's Glad Tidings in Nebraska in 1906. Another nice crowd. Notice the number of kids. There they are, not the kids, there the car is in Wyoming. Another group of, those are almost all youngsters, Sunday school classes in Wyoming in 1912. And here's Glad Tidings as it sat at one point, 1926 in Flagstaff, Arizona. That bus on the side was used by the chapel. You see it says on the top of above the windshield on the bus, Chapel Car Auto Number 3. So they would run around the countryside or the nearby town, gather up people, bring them over to the church, which was the chapel car for services or Sunday school or whatever the event might be. Here's the interior of Glad Tidings, kind of decorated for Christmas. That's kind of fun. The one thing to note here that is the big chalkboard right in the front of behind where I think that's mostly the piano or organ, or the chalkboard is behind where the preacher would do his notes from, or the Sunday school teacher would use for Sunday school classes. Much like you would envision school marms in the Old West in the one-room schoolhouse with a chalkboard in the front of the room doing her thing. Here's the Baptist car Goodwill, the fourth car that the Baptists had built in 1895 up in Oregon. It was built in 1895. This picture was in Oregon in 1916. If you can't read the sign on the side of the car, chapel car, meeting here 7:30 tonight, good music, good speaking, come. And they probably got a turnout. Oh, there's a close-up of the sign. How about that? I knew that was important. I don't know if there's a chapel car on that train or not, but we do know that the car Goodwill, at least, went across this Pecos High Bridge near Comstock, Texas, a few times. That's a pretty amazing bridge. Baker heaters, the thing on the left to keep these cars warm, what's referred to as the bane of the chapel car way of life. I think these heaters were sort of the bane of any railroader's life that had to make use of these things. They didn't work a lot. They tended to catch fire and burn down the car they're in, and they were just kind of a pain in the neck. But most of the chapel cars had them, I think. Here's Goodwill in 1929. I'm not sure where they are. I couldn't figure that out. There's the builder's plate on the car. Well, yeah, I don't think that's actually the one on the Goodwill car. It's just an example of what a Barney and Smith ID plate looked like. Here's the fifth Baptist car, built in 1898, Messenger of Peace. Yeah, it was actually finished construction in 1898. Here's a crowd of people in Washington State waiting for its arrival. There's the interior. You notice how the benches have become a little bit more permanent. I don't know if they're nailed down or not, but they certainly don't lend themselves to a whole lot of moving around. And this was the time, by the way, where specialty cars were becoming more and more the thing. There were specialty cars for circus use, specialty cars, theater cars continue to be used. Most of the railroads maintain theater cars for track inspection and that sort of thing, company executive trips and so on. And by the theater car, I mean the back end of the car is all glass. And the seating directly behind that window in the car is what they call raked seating, like a theater. The seating gets higher as it goes back away from the quote-unquote stage or screen, or in this case, window. Agriculture, of course, has its own specialty cars, even photography cars. So that was not a new idea to have some kind of specialty car. Here's a picture of the Messenger of Peace with their awnings deployed that they were carried to provide a little shade sometimes when they were sitting there and people were waiting to get in the car and that sort of thing. You notice the car is starting to deteriorate a little bit here. Messenger of Peace, after it was done being a chapel car, went into service as a diner, an in situ or in place dining car or diner, and then eventually moved to a private property. Someone probably picked it up as a collector's item or something, and I don't remember if we know any more about that or not. We'll see. The sixth Baptist car was called the Herald of Hope, and here it is in Boston, New Boston, Ohio, sorry, in 1900. Let's see, when was it? That's when it was constructed, so it would have been brand new. Here's one of the preachers who manned the Herald of Hope over its course of service. Here it is in Illinois on the back end of a train. In West Virginia, great meeting held and a church was organized. That's probably got marked down as a success then. A number of the times the cities that these chapel cars went through ended up establishing a permanent church in those cities based on the people that came together and decided to do that, but they came together as a result of gathering at the chapel car when it was in town. Here's the 7th Baptist car, Grace, as it looked in Orem, Utah. This car wasn't constructed until 1915, so it's one of the later chapel cars to come online. It was also, I'm not sure if it was the first steel car, but it was a steel car, the first ones being wood. So it was expensive. It was $21,000. The Catholics, we mentioned Episcopals, we've mentioned Baptists. The Catholics eventually came on board with three chapel cars. The first one in 1907, this one, called St. Anthony. And there's a St. Anthony from a side view sitting inside, I'm not sure what, warehouse or station place. Here it is, an interior shot as it was photographed in Iowa. A couple of the good fathers there discussing what they're going to do for service that night, maybe. Oh, before I go on, I'm not sure if I have a chance to mention this or not before. There was one significant difference in the layout of the Catholic cars versus the Episcopal and the Baptist cars. And that was the presence of a confessional. And if you look towards the front, there's an altar area with the candlesticks on it and so on. An altar table in front of that that you can see one leg of at least from the aisle. On either side of of the car, far right and far left, there would have been two doors instead of the typical door on one side for the other denominations. For the Catholic cars, one door on one side of the archway would be the passageway through to the father's living quarters, the priest's living quarters. The door on the other side would be the congregant's door to the confessional, and the priest or father would access the confessional from his side of the car. The priest's quarters, in this case, his side of the car. Otherwise, they're pretty much the same. Here's kind of a little big view of the kind of crowds that these cars sometimes attracted. There's one in Philadelphia in 1908. That's a lot of people. They're not all going to get in that car. Here's a close-up of that, the altar for St. Anthony. And, you know, look at that. I hadn't noticed this before. The door on the right is obviously the hallway into the priest's quarters, not the confessional. So the other door, which is mostly off picture to the left, would have been the confessional. Here's St. Anthony down in Louisiana in 1909. This was another one of the Catholic cars called the St. Peter, as it was dedicated in Ohio in 1912, which is when the construction was ended and it was delivered. It was built by the Barney and Smith Company, and this was one of the maybe the only chapel car that had sleeping berths on the chapel side of the car. You can see them on the upper right and the upper left here. The little curvy, that's basically the bottom of the bed. Those would swing out and down and become like an upper bunk above the seats. Kind of remind you of a sleeping car, a regular sleeping car. The chapel car St. Peter was one of the longest rail cars at the time, at 85 feet long. We're talking about 1912. A little factoid amongst the chapel car. It's also probably fair to point out that the Catholic Church Extension Society also provided mobile services in other ways besides rail. And here's one example of a motor chapel car. The Baptists did this starting in 1912. I'm not sure when the Catholics got going on it. This is a period of time when there was, just for perspective, one airplane in Alaska. You know, all this kind of transportation stuff was just getting going. They say 1938 was the first house trailer too, or quote-unquote RV. I'm not sure about that. I think I just read it in one of these chapel car books. But things were beginning to get mobile. You know, cars have been around now by 20, 30 years. So they started putting them to very interesting uses. Here's a group of First Communion kids at Helper, Utah, in front of the car St. Peter. Oh, and here's a good shot again of the confessional on the left and passageway to the living quarters on the right. This is also St. Peter, the car St. Peter. And here's the St. Peter in the winter in northern Idaho in 1923. That was cold. And the Baker heater was probably not working. In 1953, this is what the car looked like, kind of rotting away in North Carolina. Let me see on here. Oh, it was eventually, or at one point anyway, I think in the 40s, my notes say, I'm not sure. This car was parted out for about $17 $1,700 worth of cash that was used to build a church. The Barney and Smith company that made most of the chapel cars, or at least, well, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of the 13, was flooded in 1913 and never really got going again, and were out of business entirely by 1921. That might have helped the decay of the chapel car idea, although they could have had them built by Pullman or maybe other manufacturers, or remodeled from regular passenger cars if they had wanted to. I think the cars generally petered out because of replacement services. There were enough churches in enough towns throughout the West and so on by then that they didn't really need them. This is the Barney and Smith company after the flood that we're looking at here. Here's the St. Paul, which was the last of the chapel cars to be built in 1915. So this was 2 years into service, this picture taken in Louisiana in 1917. There's an interior shot. In this case, apparently it's the door on the right that goes to the confessional, and the door on the left goes back to the living quarters. Notice more movable chairs on this one, interestingly enough. Cushioned seats, we've notched up a little bit on the comfortable scale. This car is sort of it's not a real chapel car in the sense that it was not built by a denomination to run around the countryside doing church service and so on. This was a remodel of a regular coach done by a private organization to provide a church, or at least an event type space. You could do a wedding here, you could do a funeral here, you could probably just do some sort of regular party if you wanted to. Oh, and seeing that link there at the bottom of the picture reminded me, just like all the previous Parlor Car Chats, once we're done and the website page is updated, there will be links to all of the stuff that I'm either referencing or talking about on here. In this case, it's quite a list. There's probably 2 or 3 dozen links to various resources if you want to pursue your knowledge of railroad chapel cars. So anyway, this is a fresh new well, kind of fresh, renovation of a regular rail car into a car inspired by, you might say, chapel cars. It even has a pipe organ, or a pump organ, I mean, not a pipe organ, a pump organ. There's it's being used at, what do you think that looks like? A 1950s, 60s, 70s kind of picture? And my guess that's a wedding, given the boutonnieres on a number of people. The car comes, the train with that chapel car everlasting also has a dining car that's hooked right next to it, so that you could serve a reception dinner or something after your service. Here's some pictures of that church in Wyoming where some of the chapel car bits and pieces are actually built into the church. This real tall door probably was the door between the chapel area and the living quarters. There were bookcases, wall panels on the right here in this area. You can see sort of side wall panels. And those, I think, might have been window frames. They're not windows anymore, but there's the frame. That's kind of an interesting use of this stuff. That might have been a rear door, entrance door, hardware on the right here, some door hardware. All built into the church. The physical sit on the ground kind of church in Wyoming. Here's the Emmanuel again, as it looks in Prairie Village, South Dakota, kind of a display thing. Here's some interior shots of it, or what's left of it, or what was being refurbished at some stage of its refurbishment. You can tell this is not a Catholic car because it only has one door. It's on the left and it heads back into the preacher's quarters. Another pump organ. There's a nice long view of the chapel area. This is inside that car that's underneath the cover that we saw a minute ago. Some of the chairs or pews. Now those do look like they're screwed to the ground, so they're not intended to be moved much. The back railing of the car. Notice the coupler's gone. No need for that if it's sitting in place somewhere. There's a lamp from the Herald of Hope. These became collector's items of sorts. I've never found one even available that they knew where it was from, that it was from a chapel car. I would have liked to have found something, but I never did. Here's the Messenger of Peace, not too awful long ago, obviously not doing well. I think this was the one I think there was a diner at some point, but isn't even that anymore. This podium I show for two reasons. One, to give you an idea of what a podium looked like in a chapel car, but also to give you talk to the fact that it was a lot of these pieces that came out of chapel cars that made their way to on-the-ground churches throughout the West, particularly churches involved with whoever set the car up or operated it throughout its lifetime, or maybe it was a result, or as a result of that car, churches were planted in towns, and all of those type places would end up with the remnants from the chapel cars when they were taken out of service. Yeah, not looking too good. It's certainly a Pullman car, though, or a Pullman style car. You can tell that from a mile away. Behold, now is the day of salvation. Inscribed at the top of that would have been right above the altar area or the chancel area. There's a notion of some of the furniture from that world. This is what the chapel car Grace looked like not too long ago at a conference center in Wisconsin. They obviously got it, fixed it up, and now have it on display. Not unlike the Emmanuel's disposition. Another interior view. It's old enough now that you can see all these hymnal books in the pews. I don't think they had quite that many of them originally in the late 1890s. Maybe, but they certainly weren't bright colors like this. Anybody remember these fans? These handheld fans when you go to church? I do even. Not in rail cars, but in regular churches that didn't have air conditioning. There's not too many pictures that I found of the living quarters from these chapel cars, but here's one of the bedroom. A look at one of the bedrooms. There's a bookcase with some of the hymnals in it when they were stashed away. Another shot of Goodwill. And here's, well, yeah, that previous picture, Goodwill when it was up and running. Here's Goodwill as it was in 1966, stored someplace, I'm not even sure exactly. And And here's even just a few years later, it's so overgrown in the area where it got stashed, you'd be hard-pressed to even get it out of there. And here's some of the condition. There's one of those narrow doors, kind of like I built into that one church. Not looking good. You get an idea of how ornate the ceilings were painted or inlaid with wood, but clearly in pretty decrepit condition in this picture. It reminds you of those door handles that you saw that were taken out of one car and built into the church. Look at the dead sticks that have grown up. I mean, that car is just getting eaten alive by that forest. And a wheel set from one of the cars.